Great, wonderful. I'm Dinda Elliott. I'm the Director of Programs at China Institute, and thank you all so much for coming tonight to this, what's going to be a very, very interesting and hopefully important evening of conversation. I see a couple of trustees in the audience. Thank you, Yvonne Wong, for being here, and thank you, Ingrid Ehrenberg, for being here and for supporting us in everything we do. A couple of quick words about China Institute for anybody who hasn't been here and doesn't know much about us. We are really the go-to place for all things Greater China, with programs in business, society, arts and culture, and education. We have a school with more than 300 students. I know the head of our school, Shenzhen, is over there. Say hi, Shenzhen. And a gallery that brings national treasures from China. I'm excited, very excited to report that construction is underway. Thank you for bearing with us in this temporary space that we've been using. But a wall behind you is going to be knocked down in a couple of weeks, and a new modern auditorium space will open in September. We're thrilled about that. And we'll soon also be starting construction. There's a little buzzing feedback line, but anyways, construction on the 4,000 square foot Center for Contemporary China downstairs, which will bring culinary programs, art, technology, design, and other great things, bringing China to life in new and dynamic ways. That'll be opening in September of 2021. So mark your calendars. On April 16th, we're hosting an executive summit, which is focused on finding success in an age of conflict and crisis. We've confirmed the conversation of the century with Kishore Mahbubani, who's Asia's leading public intellectual, whose new book, Has China Won?, comes out that week. And he will be speaking with Harvard professor Graham Allison, who wrote Destined for War and talked about the Thucydides trap. So it's going to be a great event. We're going to have panels looking at the opening, the new post-trade deal opening of China's market, and what's going on in terms of the United States CFIUS closing of the U.S. market, and also how to mobilize business for good, businesses that are stepping in the time of the coronavirus to do whatever they can to help with that recovery process. We also want to note that we're hosting a conversation on March 4th about the coronavirus, which we're calling When Fear Goes Viral. And that's going to be featuring Council on Foreign Relations expert Huang Yin-zhong and Joan Kaufman, who is a great expert on China's healthcare system. And we're working on getting a resident of Wuhan, who we will Skype in from Wuhan to humanize the crisis, because we've seen lots of stigma attached to what's happening, what's coming out of China. So we're going to have hopefully a deep conversation about the health system, but also what happens when an entire population is stigmatized. Finally, I want to urge you all to become members of China Institute if you haven't done so already. You get all sorts of discounts on our programs, on our classes, on our exhibitions, and also invitations to exclusive events. But you also support the important work that we're doing by becoming a member at a time when U.S.-China dialogue is more important than ever. So I urge you, I think you've all got membership materials on your chairs, and so please take a look and do think about signing up. Yay, we've got them right on your chairs. So now for tonight. Hong Kong, as you know, has been convulsed by protests since last spring. We knew we wanted to do a program, but wondered what would be our particular value add at China Institute. We are not a political organization, as you know. We are a neutral platform for dialogue, and what we always strive for here is depth, insight, and nuance, since the world, as we know, is rarely really black and white. So we put together a group of panelists tonight who will help us look behind the headlines, to look at the sociology and history of Hong Kong, to look at the economics and business landscape of Hong Kong, to look at what it feels like to be a young person in Hong Kong, to be a Hong Konger. We want to try to understand how we got here. What are the elements that make Hong Kong's people identity so very different from those in mainland China, in hope of helping to advance understanding? I happened to be in Hong Kong in June just at the moment that the march of 2 million people was happening, and spent the day running around and just watching what was happening. And it was so clear at that moment that this is not just young, liberal, radical students. This is basically all of Hong Kong. And so what is it that has gotten Hong Kong to that place where so many people, regular, average Hong Kong people, feel this way? We will have time for questions at the end, and I hope you'll keep in mind that this is not a political forum. So we're not looking for political speeches. We are a forum to advance understanding. And so I would ask you all to be respectful and to ask thoughtful questions. So our panelists tonight. Ho-Fung is a professor of political economy in the Sociology department at SAIS and Johns Hopkins. He's deeply knowledgeable about Hong Kong's social and political history, and amazingly, he happens to have written a book about demonstrations and riots in the mid-Qing dynasty. Patrick Chovanec is chief strategist at Silvercrest Asset Management and a professor at Columbia's SIPA. He taught at Tsinghua's School of Economics and Management for about 5 years, and he also lived in Hong Kong in various professional capacities for about 5 years, so he also knows Hong Kong very well. Nathan Law is a student activist and the youngest person ever elected to Hong Kong's Legislative Council. His seat was overturned in July 2017 after a decision made in Beijing, and he was later jailed for his participation in the umbrella movement. Nathan is now studying for a master's degree in East Asian Studies at Yale. We're so glad that he's joined us tonight. So our moderator tonight is equally amazing. Jiayang Fan is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she's written extensively about Hong Kong and also about Chinese writers, social influencers, and a wide range of other China-related topics. So why don't you come on up and have a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much. Oh yeah, I was going to push the button. Push the button back.
Can everybody? Okay, that turned on.
You need to have a microphone, and please hold the microphone up to your mouth because we are recording.
Thank you, Linda, for that wonderful introduction. Very happy to see so many faces here tonight. This is a conversation that the China Institute has worked hard to put together for a few months, and I did a piece about the Hong Kong protests for the New Yorker at the end of last year. So it's very much so what has happened in Hong Kong, what is going on in Hong Kong, has been very much on my mind, and I am thrilled to be here with these three distinguished speakers. I want to start by just asking, I guess, Ho-Fung, if I may, about the roots of what has happened in Hong Kong. We all know, I think, or at least probably most of us know that it began with an extradition bill in June that few of us probably knew very much about prior to this spring. And from there, it ignited into rallies that numbered almost into 2 million, depending on who's counting. So it really captivated the world, and it was so unexpected, I think, to those in Hong Kong, in China, and the world. So if you can, Ho-Fung, can you tell us a little bit about your reaction to what happened to the protests as it began and as it was sparked in June? Was it something you were expecting? And also, what was your sense of what gave it the potency and the power that it held in June and the summer?
Yeah, thank you. Jiayang, and thanks Linda for inviting me and the introduction, and thanks to my co-panelists. And actually, speaking of the protest in June, it caught everybody by surprise, including myself. In fact, the Friday, I forgot the date, before the June 9, the biggest demonstration, I was in Hong Kong. I was teaching an intensive class in Taipei, and make a trip to Hong Kong, meet with friends, and one of my scholar friends who has a kind of a public diplomacy networks, they have this regular closed-door discussion about issues with consulate people from different countries, the US, UK, Europe, and so they invite me to have a closed-door discussion about the extradition bill, about the upcoming protests, and actually at that time I'm saying that no, nothing will happen. Just like 1 million, 2 million people come, and then the government continue to ignore it and pass the bill, and that is it. And so it's the expectation, and everybody seems to agree. And then, of course, then it caught everybody by surprise that how persistent the people are and how confrontational it becomes and things like that. And then I started within what is going on, and many people are asking the same question, and a lot of commentary, a lot of. I think after in a few years to come, that there are going to be a lot of academic works, journal articles, and books on that too. So something deeper is involved in this. It is, I think, two things. One is the extradition bill itself. It has kind of three parts. Many people think that it is the core of what Hong Kong way of life is. That is this kind of trust in the independence of the judicial system and rule of law and things like that, because nobody knows what is going to happen after we're extradited to mainland China. And actually, of course, there's a lot of rumor, there's a lot verified, but some of this lot of rumor as such actually is reported in a June story in Financial Times, and I forgot the exact date, but you can look it up. In Financial Times, there's a report saying that in late May, there's a dinner party between Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, with some mainland Chinese elite who has a Hong Kong residency. And then this mainland Chinese elite in Hong Kong is lobbying Carrie Lam not to do the extradition bill because, as you know, that there's a lot of mainland Chinese wealthy people that they might think that if the extradition bill is passed, that is what I expect, that they won't be necessarily targeting the dissidents or activists or even more the like, but they might be targeting all these mainland Chinese tycoon. So it is one thing that many people from around the world, including from mainland Chinese, that they are wealthy, they have business, they want to have a residence in Hong Kong because they think that they are protected by law. They are, if there's something happen to them, there's a free press and things like that. So the extradition bill number one seems to be a violation of this kind of sense of what Hong Kong make Hong Kong Hong Kong. The other thing is that even though after Carrie Lam said she suspended the extradition bill, later on then she withdrew it, and then the protest still going on. It seems that something else is still driving the protest, and then it comes the second problem, that is this police brutality. That of course is controversial. Some people think that the protest is violent and things like that. So many people, including the elite, some of them are very conservative elite in Hong Kong, is calling for a kind of independent investigation of what police has done and not abiding by the procedure and things like that. So this kind of concern about police brutality is very deep because back in the 1960s, back in the 1950s, and all these old Hong Kongers will tell you that under the British time, the police is very brutal, very corrupt. They got pocket money, not pocket money, but basically that what is it, hush money or bribery from shopkeepers, from business. So they're very corrupt, they're very brutal. And then there's a 66-67 riot or insurgency, and then after that in the 1970s, the British government reformed and then clean up the police force, set up the independent commission against corruption to arrest the police officers who are taking bribery, and many of the police officers escaped to Taiwan and never come back to Hong Kong. And then by the 1980s, that is a very clean and very legitimate, very professional police force, and people trust them. And then when they have problem, so living in Baltimore, I know what it is, that Baltimore has a police problem as well. US and many cities have this police problem. So this police accountability is something that Hong Kong people actually value, and Hong Kong police force used to be valued as a kind of one of the most professional cleaners and people's friendly kind of police force in Asia or even in the world. But it seems that this image has been shattered with how they handled the protest first in June, mid-June, and then later on. So it is the two key things that I think that this is a kind of sense of what people value Hong Kong most as what makes Hong Kong is being violated, and so it's why people are.
Right. I mean, I think those are two. I think those are 2 points that during my reporting people mentioned that the extradition bill was really the tinder that gave rise to a lot of fears, anxieties, and this growing sense that mainlanders are flooding the borders, and what does that really mean for this tiny island that has lived, with, but and also in critical ways apart from the country, across the waters. Nathan, I remember interviewing you in 2018. Then I was profiling the activist and singer Denise Ho, who has been a vocal democracy activist and LGBTQ activist. And I remember I think we met up in Admiralty, you and Joshua Hung, at a coffee shop. And this was in 2018. And at the time, I think my questions, veered toward, well, what do we do now? The political energy seems to have really sapped, and the umbrella movement just seems to be a distant memory. And you and Joshua both mentioned, the need to continue the fight, but also this sense of how demoralized people were from, the failures and the kind of the lack of resolution from the umbrella movement. So I guess for you, were you also caught off guard by what happened in June? And from the umbrella movement to what happened in June 2019, how has your positions evolved, from your beginning as a political activist to 2019?
Yeah, I think I share the same kind of like perception with Professor Hong. Like I was caught off guard when it all exploded, and we didn't really expect like that there will be 2 million people rally, 1 million people rally before June, and it was kind of like a period of time that we started to campaign on the extradition bill in March, and then at the very beginning there were just like a couple thousand people, 100,000 people coming out on the rally, and we kind of like before the first 1 million people rally, we expected that would be passed in that week, and we made that worst expectation. So I think that was definitely one of the points that exploded, and we didn't expect that. But if you look back for the between the current movement and after the Brexit movement, where there had been a period of time that people filled with frustration, desperation, and like turned into a cynical state, that we all felt that kind of like low point of Hong Kong's activism and Hong Kong's social movement. But on the other hand, in that period of time, actually there have been so many cases that could really symbolize the system has been collapsing, and the people were actually experiencing rising anger because of some of the cases. Like for example, the imprisonment of the umbrella leaders, the imprisonment of Edward Leung, and reinterpretation of the constitution of our basic law, and the unseat of the legislators. These are gross human rights violations if we look into a more liberal way, and that kind of discontents actually accumulated. And I think that is actually something that even though we didn't expect that, but we look back, we can discern all the traces that led to the explosion in June. And I think like for now, a lot of people still like cannot contemplate why Hong Kong people filled with anger and responded to the government's like suppression with that kind of passion. Like, people just cannot imagine why there will be like petrol bombs in Hong Kong and that kind of violent scene. And I think that really relates to how people see Hong Kong. Like Hong Kong people, how they feel like as a Hong Konger, how do they connect themselves into the society? There are two basic expectations for Hong Kong people throughout the implementation of one country, two system, and these are fundamental. The first one is democratization. Like people expect that, we have that expectation, Hong Kong will become more and more liberal and more democratized, and the government will like implement more and more democratic accountability. And second one is the security generated by a healthy system, that we believe in checks and balances in power, that we enjoy a certain degree of security because we have remained our way of life throughout the implementation of one country, two system. But for the past 5 years, after the Red movement and before that explosion, like these hope faded, and well, the expectation and the security collapsed and basically shattered. So I think that these kind of incidents and the things that make Hong Kong people feeling alienated from the society really triggers the utmost response from them. So I think it definitely has its root in terms of like politics, in terms of the extradition bill, but well, something more fundamental happens and took out the supposedly self of them and then transform them into another creature. And that's something that I think from like cultural and anthropology perspective could lead us to more clues what transformed the people into that form with that kind of response that we could not have been imagined Hong Kong people reacting in that fashion.
Right. I think what Nathan has said, and said so well, echoes a lot of what I heard in Hong Kong, that this sense of failed promise that the government had made with a substantial portion of the Hong Kong population, this failure of politics in Hong Kong really drove so much of the movement. Now, the other piece of this is economics, and here I want to turn to you, Patrick. You're a close observer of the Chinese economy and the Hong Kong economy for a number of years, and this is a delicate question because when I was on the streets for a number of these protests, asking about Hong Kong's relationship to China, especially the economic incentives that might encourage protesters to go out on the street, seemed to many of the people on the street to be to discount the genuine nature of their political requests. But I do, and I don't mean to do that at all, but I do think that Hong Kong's economy, its growth, and the way that that growth has evolved along with China really figures into this conversation. So, if you could, for our audience members, just in simply describe how has Hong Kong's economy changed since 1997 to now, and in your opinion, has that affected Hong Kong's political relationship with Beijing?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I was going to say, even before that introduction, that I'm very aware of why I've been invited on this panel to, in some ways, kind of be, I do have ties to Hong Kong, to China, but right now I'm sitting on kind of Wall Street. Nobody sits on Wall Street, but on Wall Street, more broadly speaking. And, I'm one of those people who says, is Hong Kong going to survive as a global financial center? Are people going to want to keep their money there? Are people going to, take their money out? And what's going to be the implication of that? I would, however, like to take a step back from that and draw on my real passion, which is history and travel, and talk a little bit about the context that helps me think about these questions. Several years ago, I wrote an article in The Atlantic called The 9 Nations of China. Nations, don't read too much political into that, I mean kind of the realms, regions that have some historical and cultural integrity to them. One of those regions, one of those 9 nations, I called the back door, which is the Pearl River Delta, Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau. And the reason I called it the back door, or Homen, right, is that expression in Chinese refers to something that, if you can't do something through the front door, you kind of go and you do it through the back door. And, business gets taken care of. And for a long, long time, that region has served that purpose in China. That, there's that expression, the mountains are high or the sky is high and the emperor is far away. And the emperor is far away from the Pearl River Delta, and so a lot of things can go on. And even, when you think of the coming of the Portuguese or the coming of the British, this was the point at which not only did they interact, but they were allowed to interact, because it was far enough away that the authorities, the emperor who was far away, could say, all right, that can take place at arm's length, maybe some good will come out of it. If bad things come out of it, we can shut it down, or at least it's far away, we can quarantine it, to use a relevant expression today. And that went on for a long, long time. But can you completely quarantine it? Can you completely control the ideas that enter? In 1911, the revolution may have begun in Wuhan, but it was originated by Sun Yat-sen operating out of the Pearl River Delta, and then he had his base in Whampoa, and it became the base for the nationalist revolution in China. So the authorities were right to be. If you were in Beijing, you were right to be concerned about these ideas that were coming in, because they could kind of infiltrate and affect the rest of the country in ways that could not be controlled. But even in the 1960s, even when the Mao was in power, it was an interesting question. Why didn't they roll the tanks into Hong Kong? Somebody asked me this when there was the possibility of military intervention more recently, and I said, well, think about it. In the 1960s, they could have, and I think they didn't. Not just because of the international ramifications. Those could have been minimized. I understand from my reading that they could have cut off the water supply and basically forced the British out without a battle, and taken over Hong Kong, which would have been sort of very nationally affirming. But why didn't they? Because Hong Kong was useful. Hong Kong was the back door. There was a back channel through there that they could contact other countries and have diplomatic contacts that they couldn't have officially, that they could have economic contacts that they didn't have officially. And then when you got into the 1980s, where did they base most of the special economic zones? It was in that region. Again, so that it could be experimented with and controlled. So that all sets up the basis for the handover. And Beijing's attitude towards Hong Kong and the establishment of one country, two systems. Because it wasn't simply that the rest of the world made China, made Beijing accept one country, two systems. In many ways, it was in their interest to have two systems. They wanted the control, but they also wanted the two systems because they wanted Hong Kong to continue to play that role of the back door. It is an incredibly important source of human capital, it's a financial pipeline to the rest of the world that's become only more important as the Chinese economy has grown and developed. It would be very challenging if that was suddenly cut off. And so but at the same time, the very freedom and the very rule of law that allows Hong Kong to be useful in that way, and it allows it to be that channel, is also the same kind of things that created the expectations and hopes that lead to unrest and demands for greater democracy and transparency and rule of law and maintenance of rule of law. So Beijing has always been in the position of, do you exert control or to keep bad things from spreading, or do you, in the process, do you risk killing the goose that lays the golden egg? And the bet all along, in many quarters, has been that Beijing would not kill the goose that laid the golden egg. That it would ultimately realize that there were limits, and that there were that one country, two systems served its interess. Although how one country, two systems will be defined is a very open question, and you know what the weight of that would be. And so this is, I just want to throw this out here at this kind of historical context. I'm happy to go into more, you know, what's happened recently and how are people around the world looking at Hong Kong, and are we seeing capital flight and things like that, and what are the risks of that. But that's the foundation that sort of informs my thinking, that there are deep historical roots here, which these recent issues are only sort of the latest manifestation of.
Right, and that, and thank you for laying that out. I think that's very helpful for everyone. One animating question, just a short question here, but an animating query throughout this summer has been, what exactly should will Hong Kong continue to play the role of a financial center? And to go back to your metaphor of the goose, the goose that lays the golden egg, I mean, has the goose reached old age? I mean, will the goose continue to lay the golden egg, or has she reached menopause and is no longer and is no longer fertile in that
Or
respect?
has this analogy, point of no return. So, ever since Hong Kong reverted to mainland control, there has been talk coming out of Beijing, coming out of the mainland, of replacing Hong Kong as China's financial center, ideally replacing it with Shanghai. I've been hearing that story for going on 30 years now. It never seems to quite happen. It's not for lack of sort of hard infrastructure. I mean, there's, high rises in Shanghai, there's a stock market in Shanghai, there's money now in Shanghai, but there isn't the same confidence in Shanghai as a place where not only can you transact in a free and reliable way, but also you can get your money in and out, but also that there's a base of local talent which is truly global in its perspective, which can draw upon global talent. That is something that is still unique to Hong Kong. And by the way, when companies, when you're in private equity in China and you're signing a contract and you're investing money, if you're not prohibited from doing so, you put in this contract is going to be settled under Hong Kong law. You don't say it's going to be settled in Shanghai. You want it to be able to go to a Hong Kong court and have sort of international standards of transparency and jurisprudence regarding your claims. Because there is not a belief that you would get a fair shake, or could at least rely upon a fair shake in a mainland court. So it has been very difficult for China to simply say, yep, we don't need the goose that lays the golden egg anymore, because Shanghai has simply not been able to step into that role.
So we've covered a little bit of politics and economics. I would like to turn to culture at this point, and I would invite both Ho-Fung and Nathan to weigh in on this. So part of what's changed, so drastically in Hong Kong in the last decade has been this influx of mainlanders to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong's not getting any bigger, but there are growing percentage of mainlanders. And I guess from a sociological perspective, and I know that you're a professor, you're in the sociology department at Johns Hopkins, how has that affected the cultural identity of native Hong Kongers? How do they perceive the new mainlanders, who on the one hand are the people that, many Hong Kongers have parents and grandparents who were born in the mainland, and culturally there are many similarities, but they've also lived apart for quite a number of decades. So what, Ho-Fung, what has changed culturally in Hong Kong in the last 10 years? How does Hong Kong view the mainlanders, and how has that, what is the shape of that evolving identity of Hong Kong natives?
It's very complicated issues.
It'll work. If you just hold it up, it'll work. If the light's on, it will work.
It is very complicated issues because the mainlanders coming to Hong Kong, actually it started long before 97. After 97, there's a kind of an increasing number in terms of immigrants and students and tourism and actually more importantly, actually capital investment. And there's a mixed bag of people there that, for example, that keep saying that this radical, localist, pro-independence people, and people think that they're nativists and things like that, but actually that the guy who invented the slogan that people are talking about and using it in the protests, Liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our time, never learn. And he himself is a mainland Chinese migrant from Hubei. And he's not behind bars charged for rioting. And then you look, I'm reading all the court case.
Hold the mic a little bit.
I'm reading the court case about these people who were charged for rioting, arrested by police. And then I find that they're actually not a lot, of course, but there's a few of them actually. When they go for the court, they don't speak Cantonese, they need translation, they only speak Mandarin. So obviously some mainland Chinese students or young people are involved in the protests. So this group of people, and at the same time, there's a huge sentiment thinking that the inundation of Chinese money in Hong Kong, actually that is related to the SARS last time. That is after the SARS epidemics and after the financial crisis, at the same time, China just got into WTO in 2001 and 2003. About that time, China adopted a policy to let a lot of Chinese company, Chinese money, Chinese capital to move to Hong Kong and use Hong Kong as a kind of intermediary place for Chinese capital to go out further to the world. And actually, you look at the statistic, you will find amazing that the #1 destination of Chinese outflow capital, 60 to 70% in Hong Kong. They don't stay in Hong Kong, of course, that they stay in Hong Kong for a while and adopt a Hong Kong identity, and then as a Hong Kong capital go to somewhere else. And also outside capital going into China, Hong Kong, 60 and 70% of FDI going into China also come from Hong Kong. But also there are a lot native Hong Kong, but somewhere else in the world. Some of them are round tripping. Like Chinese money going to Hong Kong, have a Hong Kong identity, and then invest back in mainland China to get all these policy favors as a foreign investor. So there's a lot of this money, and there's economically, there's a lot of talk about how rising and affordable housing, actually the median income of Hong Kongers and also university graduate. Actually, I look at the statistic, and between 2003 to now, there's like a slight decline, according to different measurements. Some measurements saying that it's not going up, at least, but some measurements saying that it's declined. But the housing price and the cost of living actually double, triple, and then many people will blame. And actually, it's not just a perception, but actually that is kind of a truism. Is that is this Chinese money, Chinese capital, help driving up the price. And of course, it's not only Chinese capital to blame, because it also depends on the government policy. For example, Singapore also has a lot of influx of foreign capital, Chinese capital, but the Singaporean government tried very hard to segment the the housing market for locals and the housing market for investors into more separate category. While in Hong Kong, it's one market, and then it's a housing affordability problem, and it is also there's a sense that, for example, in the financial sector, a lot of actually is widely reported in New York Times because FBI is involved in that. Is this Wall Street firms has this hire Paisley program that in Hong Kong to hire some well-connected mainland Chinese background financiers so that they can use their connection in mainland China to get business for them, and then FBI is involved in that, and the ICAC in Hong Kong is involved in this kind of practice that's kind of financial fraud or wrongdoing. But in the financial sector, you can see that this kind of people with mainland Chinese background is taking up a lot of jobs, and the locals are being squeezed out, and it has something to do with the fact that many financial firms want to have mainland Chinese business, and so on and so forth. So all these kind of things add together and create a sense of people would like to compare like the situation in Tibet as Han migrants who do the business, and local Tibetan peoples feel marginalized. They didn't benefit from the money that Beijing might be pumping into Tibet, and the same thing happened in Xinjiang. So people have this kind of a discussion now that Hong Kong is becoming like people are becoming a stranger in their own home.
And Nathan, you were born not too many years before 97, right?
Yeah, I was born in 1993.
1993, right. And you were born in Shenzhen, and so you are essentially growing up against the background of Hong Kong, where even then in the 90s, there were probably many mainlanders who were moving from Shenzhen to Hong Kong. And I know from interviewing you that you are fully, you're trilingual, you speak absolutely accentless Mandarin and Cantonese and, expert English. So for someone like you who linguistically and culturally are so fluent in all three of these spheres, how do you conceive of your own cultural identity? And against that cultural identity, what do you make of your political education? How did you then become politicized against, your very rich cultural familiarity with all these, with three different backgrounds?
Yeah, I think the identity of Hong Kong people has always been a very intriguing question to a lot of people who are not familiar with Hong Kong issue. And it has always been the negotiation, the configuration of Chineseness and Hong Kongness that creates our own identity. And that that negotiation is actually as a resistance to manifest how the political and cultural perspective of Hong Kong or cultural thoughts of Hong Kong have been changing. If we look at the survey that the HKU POP, the research center, the survey center, most prominent one in Hong Kong, they've been doing tracking all the identity of Hong Kong people, and one of the peak point was in 2008 when there were Beijing Olympic, there was Sichuan earthquake, and so many incidents that arouse your patriotic sentiments. And I remember I watched back to the awarding ceremony of the pop songs of Hong Kong, and there were so many patriotic rhetoric took place in the ceremony that we can never see it again, and that was completely another world to a lot of Hong Kong people for now. So definitely since 2008 to 2010, the Hong Kong identity as a collective identity have been shifting towards Hong Kongese drastically, and that is definitely a result of Hong Kong people resisting that kind of Chinese influence in a bad way, resisting one country swallowing two systems, and they form their own identity to combat that. And going back to Professor Hong's point, I think one of the probably most famous slogan that Hong Kong people uses as an analogy to Xinjiang, saying that, yesterday Xinjiang, today Hong Kong, and they also get that analogy to Taiwan, saying that today today Hong Kong, tomorrow Taiwan. They're actually connecting all the periphery of China and seeing China adopting the same strategy, applying to them. And that strategy is, unfortunately, is weaponizing all the China-Hong Kong policies, including immigration policy, cultural policies, economic policies, and seeing them as weapons to pierce through the Hong Kong culture and destroying our own identity and our way of life. So I think that is actually so unfortunate that that kind of conception is applied to every single layer of China-Hong Kong policy and creates so much drastic conflicts between Chinese and Hong Kongese that we could constantly see every day. But I also think that it is unavoidable because that is how Chinese government, that they manipulate their power to create internal conflicts between people in order to achieve their own political interest and political needs. And that kind of conflict indeed creates a lot of unity among Chinese people, that they always see Hong Kong as rebellions, who are the kids that do not treasure their mother's giving, and mumbling, grumbling, and meddles, all the things happening in China. Well, it definitely achieved that goal, but what it causes is the constant conflicts between people, like most of the time in an unnecessary basis. So I think that kind of weaponization of the China-Hong Kong policy indeed caused generations of Hong Kong people and Chinese people creating in a conflictual situation that it could have been avoided if China really treasured the promises of one country, two systems to restrain themselves from trying to being dominated in Hong Kong. So I think for now, my identity is also kind of like an analogy to what Hong Kong's been through. Like me myself, actually, I was growing up in a pro-Beijing school. I sang national song on Tuesday and Thursday, and I don't know, maybe they have special occasion, and maybe the students love to hear about that, I don't know. And I watched the flag raising ceremony the day after, the national song, things like that. And I didn't learn anything about human rights, freedom, or fortune during classes. And those are my personal pursuits outside my academic curriculum. And one thing that really inspired me, and kind of like the overdone of that kind of school was, I remember vividly that on the day after Liu Xiaobo got his Nobel Peace Prize, and the principal of our school publicly denounced him the day next of his reception. And I was so curious because I thought that people getting Nobel Prize are the ones who are excellent in that area. So why is such a person being criticized? And I started to, it triggered my curiosity. I looked into information and looked into data of that. So I think that kind of example really shows, well, the policy or that kind of manipulation of the education or cultural policy or whatsoever indeed create create a pushback or create adverse effects that they could not have expected. And somehow, Hong Kong for now is also a bigger version of myself coming back, going against that kind of rhetoric and that kind of manipulation. So I think, the identity, the constant negotiation, and that kind of reaction towards China policy and that kind of, very instinctive reaction towards the weaponization of China-Hong Kong policy indeed create the fundamental tone of the situation we have today now.
I think that was, I thought it was particularly beautiful the way that you said that you yourself are kind of a product of that process of Hong Kong identity as it stands in 2020, capturing so many of the conflicts, both political and cultural, kind of within you. Patrick, I think I'm weakest in, I'm least well-versed in economics. And when I was talking to experts and members of the financial institution in Hong Kong, people often refer to the Greater Bay Area, which is, sort of the Zhuhai, these coastal cities close to Hong Kong, and there is this hypothesis that maybe China is trying to, in a way, harmonize Hong Kong into the Greater Bay Area, really make Hong Kong just another stop, another city kind of on this, in this southern region that is, economically vibrant but still politically submissive to Beijing. I'm curious about the plausibility of such a theory that Hong Kong, when we look ahead, 10 years, 20 years, does that seem credible to you that the Beijing will try to make Hong Kong something like Shenzhen, a city that has that is economically quite free, and that might have more Wi-Fi zones, but still is politically very much beholden to Beijing. Is that particular political route? Does that seem feasible to you?
So one of the things that Beijing clearly tried to do after Hong Kong came back under its control was to co-opt the elites in Hong Kong. And we haven't really had much of a discussion about the role of the elites in Hong Kong. But the way they went about it was to say, because China was developing at that point, there was a lot of interest in business opportunities in the mainland. And Hong Kong, yes, people make money off of property and whatever, but it's a pretty small place. It's a city. And the real big money was to be made in the mainland. And so the idea was, look, if you cooperate, if you participate, if you actually participate in the governance of Hong Kong in a cooperative and a subordinate way, then you will harvest the benefits. You will get the business opportunities, and a lot of them did. Now, before we were having a discussion before the panel, it seems like it's also sort of shifted in the other direction now, where there's more and more people from the mainland. I recently heard that one of the complaints of the Hong Kong elite is that all these mainland developers are coming in and bidding up the price of property, and we can't compete with that because they get easy money. But that certainly was a goal. The question, though, is, do you want Hong Kong to be just another Chinese city? And that kind of gets back to what I was, asking originally, is that, there are hundreds of Chinese cities that have more than 1 million people and churn out lots of products and, build lots of developments, and you can make money. But if Hong Kong is Shenzhen, why do you need it? If it's not serving a role that's either complementary to Shenzhen or actually transcends what Shenzhen could ever be. And that's where I think the rub comes in terms of, killing a goose to lay the golden egg, because what makes Hong Kong special, what makes it attractive, is that it isn't any other Chinese city. And if you reduce it to that, then what have you really got? The cultural conversation, I just want to add something to the very interesting questions of cultural identity and political identity that you were having. One of the big questions that I was asked in New York and DC over the past year or so was, when these protests took place in Hong Kong, is this going to spread? Is this going to spread into the mainland? Is this the spark that lights a bigger conflagration? And the key, and what I said was, well, it could really go either way, because it really depends on how people in the mainland view these Hong Kong protests. On the one hand, they could say, well, yeah, these people are frustrated about the same things that we're frustrated about, whether it's economic or political or, accountability, transparency, etc. That was Zhong Nanhai's worst nightmare, was that people would identify with the people protesting in Hong Kong across China. But there's a lot of mutual resentment between people in Hong Kong and mainlanders, even mainlanders in Hong Kong. And I know we've seen some of the complexity of this, but I'm going to try to reduce it to something a little bit more binary, which is that and I'm speaking as an outsider, but I've seen it, is, Hong Kongers look at mainlanders and say, they're the country cousins, they're not as sophisticated, and the fact that they're now as rich or richer even makes it worse, right? The mainland people look at the Hong Kong people and say, you're so snooty, you look down on us. My wife is from the mainland, and she came out of some cabs sometimes. It was like, the cab driver was so rude to me, when he heard me speak Mandarin. And that they get spoiled, and that's why they're complaining so much. I mean, you even refer to that, that perception that, they're complainers. Beijing, the government of Beijing played on that. Very, sometimes in a subtle way, sometimes in a very clear way, to drive a wedge, to say, they're not you. They're very different. You shouldn't identify with, why they're protesting. And I think that it very successfully dealt with the issue that they were most concerned about, which was the spread of protest. The containing the discontent in Hong Kong, and not having people in the mainland identify with it and then imitate it. And it's interesting because even the what you were talking about, Nathan, which is the motivation of a sense of being different, of wanting a different future. They, in some ways, when people on the mainland heard that, they went, right, that's different. They're different. Okay, they want to be different, and so I don't identify with that. Which, I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just that was a wedge that the government of Beijing played very successfully, and the consequence was that it ended up being just a Hong Kong thing.
Terrific. Well, we have about 20 minutes left, and I would love to open it up to the audience. I'm sure you guys have many questions. A wise man once told me that a question is not a statement. So we're looking for questions, something that one of the folks up here can answer. So I would just I just would love everyone to keep that in mind. All right, that gentleman in the back.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to the panel for
Can
your...
you identify yourself first?
Yes.
I'm a member. Thank you for your exposition. You have already alluded to the central government of the mainland being somewhat intrusive into the goings-on in Hong Kong. My question is somewhat related. I notice, from what I read in the papers, that the central government has been promoting, probably pushing Chinese, Han people maybe, into the Huigar area to quote-unquote change the dynamics of the culture. I'm wondering if a similar process is going on by the central government on purpose to allow mainlanders to move into Hong Kong to de-Hong-Kongized, I don't know if that's a word.
It's a very good question. Does anyone want to take that?
Yeah, why don't you share the mic? Okay, thanks.
A quick, actually there's some research having been done about this. Not exactly like what you said in what Han migration to Uyghur area to change the culture. But for example, they even talk about the weaponization of the immigration policy. That is a can of worm that is very difficult to say clear, because now there's a recent political scientist by the name of Mark research on the voting pattern. That because now for Filipinos, for all other people who migrate to Hong Kong, who move to Hong Kong, it is the quota and the screening is done by the Hong Kong Immigration Authority. But for mainland Chinese moving to Hong Kong, the screening and all this vetting authority is not in Hong Kong government, but in the public security office in mainland China. And actually, there's some ex-communist members who write about this kind of quota control by the mainland Chinese authority going to Hong Kong, is that they're using it to select people to Hong Kong. Some of them may be party member or whatever. And at the same time, Hong Kong government didn't know who they are until they arrived, but the liaison office, that is the central government representative the office in Hong Kong, know before they move to Hong Kong. So once they arrive in Hong Kong, they will organize a lot of social activities, a lot of help, and create networks. And then when voting time, that they will become a kind of a voting bloc that the establishment party will mobilize. And they know that their phone number, they know that they are from Jiangxi, which village, and they have detailed information. So what the political science research showing that is a really clear pattern, that this neighborhood with a lot of these kind of migrants, they tend to overwhelmingly vote for establishment parties. So there is a political consequence, and this is what I think Marxism mean by weaponization of immigration policy. And of course, the Democrats are also trying to break that mold, to try to provide surveys and also organize this group of migrants. But with the imbalance of resources, is very difficult. It's one aspect of it.
All right, let's run another one.
Identify yourself.
Sure, thanks. Michael Wong. I'm a journalist, but more importantly, I was a professor at Lingnan University, your university, as well as at University of Michigan's program in Shanghai. One of the things that has struck me, and you alluded to this as well with the sort of making Hong Kong not as important a city, it was suggested to us to tell students that their future is not in Hong Kong and is somewhere on the mainland, to tell our students this. And then there were actually advertisements with the bridges and the new train, that students should look to their future. It was actually Pearl Television would have ads like that. So Nathan, what do you think is the future for, and if others want to answer this as well, what is the future for young people in Hong Kong, and how has that fueled the protests? Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I've talked to people, I've talked to protesters, frontline ones. I could sense that in their eyes they have lost the concept of future. They put the emphasis on the present, and they put the emphasis on the day after tomorrow and the very near future that, well, they're thinking about a question whether they could survive, whether the most fundamental, most basic things in Hong Kong could still being retained. So I think if we talk about future for now to them, we're asking the wrong question, because what they see is a complete disastrous consequence of constant intrusion in human rights and overwhelming power exerted in Hong Kong that destroys all our social fabrics and our believed way of life. So I think for them, for those hardcore protesters, they really think that if they don't resist now, there's nothing left. And that kind of protest mentality becomes overwhelming and predominantly creating themselves. So I think for now, it is it's a common mentality for people that they have to resist immediately. They don't have another chance in the future. But I think if we pull back a little bit, not to indulge in that kind of sentiment, I think for now the reason why we feel like there's no hope for the future, of course, there are lots of China-Hong Kong policies that really extract all the resources originally designated to the Hong Kong people into Chinese people, because that is intentionally made by Chinese government. For example, the position in a lot of banking industry, in a lot of high-end industry in Hong Kong, and the property market, the demand of the property market does not serve the local needs. It serves investment needs. It serves the needs of broad picture than Hong Kong citizens, and this constructs a future that is really dim. And for Hong Kong people, maybe for now, the only comfort that they could get is to get back a Hong Kong that is a bit more familiar to them, and I think that is their future. Going back to a Hong Kong that they feel secure, that they have expectation that the system running today, that will be running tomorrow. The system that could define justice could also operate well in the future, instead of witnessing all of the system collapsing or being destroyed in a daily basis. So I think it is not necessarily a very economical or very a broad sense of future, but somehow that's what they're thinking. That's what sustain their identity, and that's what really triggers them to fight fiercely and even cost them all they have.
Hi, I'm Henry Tang. And I would have a question here addressed to all three of you, but most especially to Patrick. How large a factor in what's going on is the tycoon factor in all of this? The three of you have indicated that it's in the background. Case in point, for instance, in the course of the last 30 or 40 years, best as I know, and I'm a person with a Hong Kong background, there hasn't been a Hong Kong person who's worked for a Hong Kong company and after 25, 30 years has risen to the level of CEO or senior position, mainly because the factor in Hong Kong, the phenomenon in Hong Kong, is all that those positions are reserved for family members.
So the issue that you raised, which is the predominance of family-owned businesses, is an issue actually throughout Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. But and it gets to development of corporate governance, which is a challenge. It's one thing if you're operating out of a city, which is based upon, in large part, concessions that have been achieved either transparently or in an untransparent way. That is a real economic challenge. I think what's interesting about the most recent protests, and I'll contrast them with the umbrella protests, is that it's one thing to want greater representation in democracy, and that, it was a colony before. People, the British kind of at the very end began to institute some Republican institutions, but representative institutions, but fundamentally it was a colony. And so there never really was a democracy in China. Now you can think about why people value democracy, and certainly the development of a middle class and a property owning class and people wanting those kind of protections and those kind of freedoms. It all makes sense. But it's one thing to want something that you've never had or never had fully, and it's another thing to face the loss of something which you've had for a long time and that you've relied upon, which is rule of law. Because as opaque as Hong Kong may be in many business respects, at the end of the day, you can go to a court, you can, there are contracts, there are things like that, and people put a lot of faith in that. And the prospect of extradition, I think, not only scared some of the mainlanders who had sought refuge from the corruption crackdown through their Hong Kong residency, but also many people who basically grew up in Hong Kong saying, I know what happens in the mainland, which is they come knocking on your door and you don't hear nobody hears from you for a couple months until you've confessed and something's happened. I don't know. Maybe you reappear, maybe you don't. Versus I know what my life has been in Hong Kong, which is, may not be the peak of transparent corporate governance, but at least I have some reliability in terms of what happens to me and what my property rights and legal rights are. And the prospect of losing that, I think, resonated much more broadly than the possibility of having greater democracy. It's not to say that one is more important than the other. It's just that when you have something, the possibility of losing it, especially if you've built a lot on it, the possibility of losing it hits you deeper and more immediately than what you aspire to. And if you think about the roots of the American Revolution, it wasn't, people had read John Locke and said that that's great, we ought to have a democracy, not a king. It was people said, we're being taxed and we don't have a say about it, and I'm gonna lose out as a result. And that's what really drove, that reaction. So, I don't know whether that exactly answers your question, but I think a lot more people in the Hong Kong elite, a lot more people who had built something in Hong Kong feared losing it if Hong Kong lost its distinctiveness.
If I may comment on that remark, okay? Basically, the question was asked.
If it's brief, okay?
Basically, the question was asked regarding economic opportunity, or to put it another way, basically a corporate class ceiling on all of Hong Kong salaried people. You answered it perhaps more on the democracy side, and as many Hong Kong people will say to you, for 150 years there was never democracy to begin with.
Right.
So to address the question on the democracy purposes, perhaps maybe the others could answer it a little differently.
Just very quick response, and actually I agree with Patrick said this rule of law is very important. Also, freedom of press is very important. That make Hong Kong. That why people want to do business in Hong Kong, and why China tried to create a Shanghai Free Trade Zone a few years ago. And there's a lot of talk about it being replacing Hong Kong. In the end, it didn't work, and then there's empty office and empty streets over there. Because then Hong Kong is a place that you can do business that not only rule of law, but also if there's some shady thing going on about the corporate governance, about things that people can report about it, journalists can report about it. And then the question is, in the end, whether you can continue to have this authoritarian, undemocratic government to protect this rule of law and freedom of press, and then more and more people in Hong Kong just think that to move forward, that democracy is one way to actually protect this freedom of press and freedom of speech, and also the rule of law from deteriorating. And at the same time, it actually is also about a very practical issue of governance. Now, the one problem of the Hong Kong government is they lack legitimacy and it lack accountability, and then it becomes more and more incompetent. Look at how it handle the disease right now. So many people also think that, including more and more of these conservative elites, start to realize that actually the democratic election may not be a bad idea if it can create a government that actually has the mandate and has the legitimacy actually to govern more effectively.
One of the narratives that came out of the mainland was that this is not really about democracy or rule of law, these protests. These are really rooted in economic frustration. And I'm going to kind of punt on that, and I would be interested in hearing what Nathan has to say about the balance between, these motivations.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think economic problem play a role in this complex. But what makes Hong Kong people, like especially younger generation, who predominantly support the movement, and well, most of them are like losing their job to protest, and now for them they create their own well, kind of like consuming circle that they buy things from like people that they share the same values and things like that. I think most predominantly, like for them, it is not because they cannot earn that money. It is because that they feel bad when if they have to like bend their knees or like kowtowing to earn that money. I think that kind of habitat makes them alienated, like feeling alienated from the society, and that kind of like economic strain that they've been facing does not necessarily translate to that kind of huge discontent that we have. And especially when you look at the recent protests, like those like bankers coming out on the street during lunch hours, doctors and nurses, they're having a lot of like well, a lot of actions, a lot of protesters, and these are high-end people in Hong Kong, and they don't really need a reform in the society to remain a very well-off life, but these people still come out. So I think that's definitely more than economy, and economy is one of the factors that drive them to feel like they're alienated in the society and they have no place for them. I think that is actually the most important thing that drives people to protest.
Right. Just quickly, I'm afraid none of us have really addressed James' question about tycoons. So I just want to say a few sentences about that. That was also a point I was very interested in investigating when I was in Hong Kong. The narrative that I heard was that in '97, when Beijing was thinking about how to, bring Hong Kong back under its wing, it had hoped to strike a bargain with the tycoons. In winning the support of the tycoons, Beijing thought that perhaps the masses would follow. That worked out for some time. I mean, even Carrie Lam, when she asks, when you look at who she's asking for political advice, she is going to these tycoons. What happened with the extradition bill was that it struck fear in many tycoons' minds that if any Hong Kongers can be spirited away back to Beijing willy-nilly, then their safety has been compromised. So that caused somewhat of a realignment among some tycoons. Do they still want to be tacitly giving their support to Beijing if their own welfare is much more in jeopardy? So that I just want to quickly address that question about tycoons. Sure.
Here, I got a microphone coming around.
Great.
Here you go. And pass it back.
Thank you. My name is Brett. I'm a data analyst and Chinese language enthusiast. My question is, tonight we heard a lot of this us and them sort of narrative between Hong Kong and the mainland. My question is, where does Taiwan's role play into this, as there is also a similar narrative between Taiwan and mainland? I'm just curious if you guys know if the tensions or the relations between Hong Kong and Taiwan have changed since these protests, that they kind of see each other more similar or more apart.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the a consequence of this movement is it connects the periphery of China, which they see it. China has been manipulating same kind of like weaponized policies towards them, and they go after Xinjiang first, and they're coming after Hong Kong, and Taiwan is feeling really threatened now. So that I think the notion brought by Xi Jinping early last year, of like possibly implementing one country, two system in Taiwan actually triggered enormous worries, and it basically saved DPP's campaign. And that kind of interaction between different places actually played out in last year. And I think like for now, of course, Hong Kong people, were more and more aware that a democratic system could really well, act on behalf of the people, like for their interest, and that kind of divergence drew out really drastically in the way that Taiwan's government and Hong Kong government dealt with the coronavirus outbreak. I think it was such a pity that the Hong Kong government, that was the golden chance for them to prove that even if they are in an authoritarian mode of governance, that they could outperform the democratic institution in order to remain that legitimacy, saying that, oh, even though we are not democratic, but we are more competitive, we are more efficient, we have more resources to be deployed, instead of like arguing inside different camps. But the performance of Carrie Lam was just a disaster, and it kind of like manifests the intrinsic contradiction of one country, two systems. Is if you serve one country predominantly over two systems, that it is not working definitely in Hong Kong. A lot of speculation about why Carrie Lam did not close the border, did not adopt more rapid measures to kind of like cut off the ties, cut off the flow of Chinese people who are going to Hong Kong, make that possibly infect more people on the ground. Is like they have the order of Beijing that they cannot close that. So if that kind of complex playing out, Carrie Lam has to obey whatsoever spoken by Beijing, and they just overlook or neglect all the benefits of Hong Kong people, then the discontent and the resentment of the public has to arise, and that is exactly the case now. So I think the performance of Taiwanese government, on the other hand, draws a huge contrast. They really have been taking care of their citizens, and Taiwanese people are feeling a sense of security and trust towards the government, which more than 80% of Hong Kong people, they do not have towards Hong Kong. And it also kind of that is definitely a golden chance that Carrie Lam missed in order to appease the protests, and they just lost all the legitimacy of remain undemocratic and authoritarian in Hong Kong.
Last question.
Where does that go? Over here? Okay, there you go.
Thank you. My name is Christian Mark. I'm with the Harvard Imaging Institute, and I wonder if instead of talking about the roots of this present situation, you could each briefly describe what you think will happen in the next 6 to 12 months. What will the Hong Kong government do, and maybe what should they do, in your opinion?
Very quickly, look back the history of the anti-subversive legislation, the Article 23 in 2003. That actually is a very interesting and unfortunate coincidence of this political anger coincided with the anger of government's incompetence in containing and dealing with a disease. You will still remember that there is this kind of a protest going on, simmering against the anti-subversive law in fall 2002 and spring 2003, and then the SARS broke out, and then the government didn't do a very good job in containing it, and so all this anger add together after the disease subsided. That is a big July 1st demonstration, and definitely make a big splash. And this time around, it's very coincidental that we have this kind of a lingering discontent about police brutality, about the Carrie Lam's incompetence in handling the situation of protests, and all this lingering anger. And then we have the outbreak of the novel coronavirus that initially, actually many protesters think that, perhaps that maybe it gives Carrie Lam a chance to do well in containing the disease, and then people will suddenly support the government again. But in the end, that is not the case. It seems that Carrie Lam is making things worse, missing an opportunity to winning back people. And now it's like the most conservative people who are against the protests are also complaining a lot about the government handling of the situation. So I can foresee that in the immediate future, if the disease subsided and all this anger add together might become another fuse, and then legislative council election is coming up in September. It's going to be a very political year in the fall, and then there's some people digging up the big data thing and find that this online traffic about anger of the government actually in recent weeks because of the disease is actually a big eruption bigger than any time during the anti-extradition protest. So something is simmering under the surface. It seems that it's not going to go away, the discontent.
Yeah, I think the question, the answer lays down on like, will China change after the coronavirus outbreak, after the death of Dr. Li, and after such a massive awakening in the mass public in China? As far as I know, that kind of shock of the death of Dr. Li has been creating a lot of different thoughts, provoking a lot of different thoughts in Chinese people. And the whole handling of the coronavirus outbreak really shows all the drawbacks of like lack of information, the lack of accountability, and the lack of freedom of speech, and all the drawbacks of these elements actually could potentially provoke some changes in mainland China. And also, definitely, there is the lack of civil society. When people wanted to donate money, donate resources, they don't know who to give, what organization are credible of handling those things. And these actually plant a lot of seeds of doubt in them. But can these thoughts translate into actions, transform into concrete collective actions in mainland China after that kind of resentment, after that kind of like wave of temporary openness of the freedom of speech? And I think that is the question that affects the future of Hong Kong. And I think, like Professor Hong has concluded a lot of things happening in the near future of Hong Kong. And I think that kind of interaction between the political habitat of China and the politics of Hong Kong is also one thing that we cannot neglect.
There was a point during the protests when I wasn't convinced, but I was reluctantly coming to the conclusion that we would wake up and the PLA would be in Hong Kong. And I remember the G7 was meeting at that time, and I said, really the G7 should be thinking, spending its time thinking about contingency plans financially, in terms of the financial shock that would create for the rest of the world when you have a global financial center that would essentially have to shut down free transfers in and out, because there would be at that point a rush to the exit for money. And I worried about the consequences of that. That was avoided because about a day or two later then they said we're taking the extradition bill away. And it removed the immediate driver for the protests. But by that time already, the driver for the protests had shifted from the extradition bill to the breakdown in relationship between the police and the community. And that is lingering, and that will continue to have an impact when stresses come. And I worry about that, because what happens in China, in the mainland, I think does matter. I do think that the impact of the coronavirus and its handling will lead to a push for greater transparency and accountability. I do think that if it is really mishandled, it could, and continues to be perceived as being mishandled, it could weaken Xi Jinping. But I don't think it fundamentally changes the attitude of the Communist Party in wanting to exert greater control over Hong Kong and being very ambivalent about the goose that lays the golden egg. And so I think that we're kind of in a rest period of which, Beijing has sort of backed off of its immediate push to impose something. There'll be a period of quiet in which Beijing doesn't push anymore, at least not obviously. And then there will be something else, maybe a couple years down the road, in which they will push again. And what it will be pushing on is, though, a society where, unless they've repaired that relationship between the police and the authorities and the community, I think it's a much more fragile sort of situation.
Well, on that note, I think that concludes our event for tonight. Thank you so much for coming, everyone, and thank you for the group.